Chapter 14. The Breaker of the Law. Double check the microphone here, and I've also noticed that there seems to be a noticeable difference the closer I get to the microphone to my mouth, but I don't want to cover up my face. Probably holding it here is still the ideal thing. Just covering up my chin. The first days of thaw had brought wet dissolution into the land before Kakumee and his train of dog teams came again to the River of Men. He crossed the cold surface water which lay above the old ice of the river, and he came in sight of the igloos he had left behind months before. The child saw him first and ran screaming into an igloo, crying, "It kill it! It kill it! Kiai! The Indians come!" It was an ancient warning which had not found a use for a generation of men, but which was still preserved in the bloody tales of those days when the It Kill It bands used to fall on isolated Helmwood camps and butcher the people. Now the old cry brought men tumbling out of their igloos, fitting arrows to bows, and tearing the rawhide caps from the sharp points of deer spears. They came out to meet a great danger and a sudden attack. What they saw was no band of It Kill It, but only a single man clad in the skins of the people. And they lowered their bows and let their spears sink to the ground, for they did not know that the danger which was coming upon them was far more to be feared than the attacks of the It Kill It had ever been. And they were partly reassured by the familiar formula the stranger called out. "I come from the right side of the ridge." Some of the men recognized the voice of Kakumee, who had disappeared so suddenly in the early days of the winter. Kakut had said then that the torn rack of Kakumee had come for him in the night and had carried him into the life beyond life. Now those who recognized the voice grew afraid, and the huddle of men on the high bank overlooking the river grew tighter. One whispered the thoughts of all. "Eno! A ghost comes on the river, the spirit of him who is dead. What do we do?" Maybe Kakut was right. The torn rack did come for him. Kakumee saw a knot of men, armed, and so he cried, "Aye, you on the bank, it is only Kakumee who comes, and I return from the land of the Kablunai, bearing gifts for the people." It was to have been his great moment of triumph. He who had dared the indescribable terrors of that long journey was returning laden with much more wealth than even the white man who had visited the river had carried in his canoes. Again and again he called out, but the cluster of men stood silently on the bank, and no one acknowledged the hail of Kakumee. Women peered furtively from the holes melted in the igloos by the thaw. The huskies stood about, growling deep in their throats, for they had caught the unfamiliar scent of the Indian dogs, and they too were alarmed. Then Kakut came from his igloo, which stood apart from the rest. Kakut, the shaman, was a wise man, wiser than any of the old ones in the camp. Though he himself was still young in years, he stood on the shore, looking steadily at his brother, who had halted a few hundred feet from the shore. At last he turned to the men who watched from the cliff and chided them for their fears. "This is the man, my brother, and not his spirit. When did you ever hear of a ghost who drove dog teams up the river of men?" The tension dissolved. Women and children poured out of the igloos, and hurrying feet rustled over the brown clumps of brittle dead moss on the snow. The dogs broke into long, wavering howls as the camp came alive. Kakumee reached the edge of the shore, and a dozen men sprang down to untether his dogs as he stepped forward and solemnly touched noses with Kakut, his brother. People clustered around the man who had returned from the dead, and they cast curious glances at the long, skin-covered sled which held the balance of the wealth he had brought. Now he cut the thong lashings of the skins covering the load. It was his moment, and the cries of amazement as the people looked on the fabulous things on the sled were sweet to the ears of Kakumee. 5 rifles, a case of black powder, a box of bar lead, a shotgun, 3 cases of tea, bags of flour, salt, and white sugar, bolts of cloth, axes, stone knives, snow knives, and kettles. These were but part of the load. It was a wealth unbelievable. For a few moments fear returned to the hearts of the people. It was beyond comprehension how a mere man could have come by such things. Yet flesh and blood is real enough to the touch. Kakumee was real, beyond doubt. Things on the sled were real too, and fear ebbed away from the people to replaced by a mounting excitement and an overwhelming curiosity. The close circle of men, women, and children began to give free rein to the fascination which gripped them. They closed in on the sled as one person, and their curious hands clutched, tore, picked up, and discarded the things which they saw. Things were passed from hand to hand, boxes were pried open, things were spilled and dropped in the snow. It was carelessness that caused a sack of flour to spill. It was not envy that made men handle the rifles, and it was with no thought of possession that they exclaimed over the razor sharp steel of the short handled axes. Kakumee must have realized this, for he had been gone from the river for only 5 months of his life. Yet, if he did realize what this attack on his sled really meant, the realization was not enough to stifle the unease of his devil. He fought his way to the center of the excited mob of his people and tried to restore his things to the sled, but as fast as something was returned, something else would seize it and pass it about. And Kakumee, working as at an impossible task, began to lose his control. He kicked a child who plunged its finger into the torn sack of flour, and only because the excitement was great did this unforgivable act go unchallenged. Desperation rose in the mind of Kakumee. He forgot that these things were to be traded for furs. He knew only that the hands of other men were grasping what was his. His! His bargain with the white trader was forgotten forever. He screamed imprecations into the unheeding ears of the people, and his face was set in a mask of rage which he was never to leave it again. Then it happened. Kakut, who had been quietly watching from a few feet away, now stepped forward and picked up a rifle. He looked at it with pleasure, and then, with the nonchalance of a man who knows the law and respects it, he turned from the sled and began to walk off to his igloo with the rifle held in the crook of his arm. It was no more than his right. A rifle would be of great aid to him in supporting a family swollen by the addition of the wife and child of Kakumee. Kakumee himself had a rifle, 5 rifles in fact, and a man has no need or desire for more things than he can use with his own hands. It was the creed of the people that what a man had he shared with his neighbors. Had not taken more than a dozen steps when Kakumee saw what had happened. He acted with such speed that no one could have stopped him, had anyone dared to try. He seized one of the axes and, leaping after his brother, caught him a slashing blow on the shoulder with the keen edge of the axe. Kakut spun about with his free hand clutching the wound, while blood poured between the gaps of his fingers. He stared into the face of his brother, and for a long moment there was a terrible silence. The mob by the sled was stricken into a quietness which was heavy with foreboding. There was no sound but the labored breathing of Kakumee. Then he cried out in a great voice so all the people might hear, and these were his words: "All this that I have is mine, and mine only. Hear me well, Kakut, for if I must argue with you about this, then I shall argue with a man who is dead." Now a sense of sacrilege possessed the watching people, for they were beholding the flagrant violation of a law as old as life. This thing was without precedent in the memory of the Helmwood. Yet not only was the law of material things being openly flouted, but Kakumee had also broken another law, for he had struck a man in his anger, and that man was his brother. This was madness. Kakut was a brave man and one who did not shrink from danger. Perhaps it was an awareness of the madness of Kakumee that made him act as he did. Or perhaps, since he was a shaman, he knew the true strength of the devil shining from the eyes of his brother. Kakut let the rifle slide to the snow and walked slowly away to his igloo. The devil had won. Now it was free of all need to hide behind the face of Kakumee. It It was free now to work its full will on the people by the river of men. When Kakumee came back with the rifle, he did not seem to notice that the people had all disappeared and the shore was deserted. Carefully, he packed up the scattered things and replaced them on the sled. He hitched up his dog teams, and when all was ready, he turned his leader out on the ice and drove his teams up the river. Behind him, in a silent camp, fear was beginning to quicken. Of all living things, the Helmawit most fear a madman, and it is the rule that such a one must die, and his name must never again be spoken by living lips. But in the camp of Kakut there could be no such easy release from the danger of one who was mad. Kakumee was a shaman who could not easily be harmed by human hands. Moreover, he had gone from the camp, and not even Kakut had the courage to follow and face the evil spirits Kakumee would unleash against a pursuer. Yet if men could not follow, words could. Early the next day, the word began to pass up and down the length of the river as dog teams drove out from the camps of Kakut. Kakumee, son of Ajut, has come back to the land, and he is filled with the madness. These words branded the shaman as an outcast. A wave of uneasiness swept through those camps where they dwelt over 1,000 men, women, and children, who now heard of Kakumee's return and feared for the evil that he might do. It was barely 2 weeks before those fears were realized. A strange sickness broke out in the camp of Kakut. 3 women sickened at once, complaining of a great pain that sat on their chests and denied them air for their lungs. The magic of Kakut was helpless against this new evil, and in a little time those women died. Then the great pain, as it was called, swept on up the river, into the hidden camps by the lakes, and all over the face of the land. Thinking of the don't remember the name of the author, but the great, somewhat civilization worshipping historical novel or historical book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, Jared Diamond, yeah, and how the disease of white men and civilization was so devastating to tribal peoples. I don't think I mentioned the book in the chapter where uh, Mowat is talking about resistance to disease and starvation, but deserves mention. Before the end of that spring, more than a third of the people were dead, and the disease had broken the people. In many camps by the river, no living men were left to bury the dead. The wolverines, foxes, and even the dogs, which had been abandoned by death, grew fat on the flesh of the Helmawit. Only small, fleeing groups of living men remained, and those who were scattered out over the length and breadth of the plains in their attempts to escape from the killer against which they had no defense. In those isolated places, cut off from their fellows by fear, the survivors waited for death and cursed the name of Kakumee. The winter before the coming of the great pain had been a hard one, for it had been long protracted. But there had been no deaths from hunger that winter, though the Helmut had been weak and lacking in strength, when the coming of spring and Kakumee brought the plague to their land. The killer which Kakumee had brought with him from the place of the white men, perhaps even from that little cabin where he had believed he looked on the frozen face of his devil, struck down the hungry folk of the barrens. When summer was old, the land was not as it had been in the first days of spring. The river of men was deserted, and only hasty graves on its banks remained to mark the inhabitations of men. In the years to follow, the river never again saw the great camps of the Helmut, for now it had changed its nature and had become the river of ghosts. Though men sickened and died in all the camps, Kakumee, who had brought the great pain, did not sicken, for he was well fed and lacking for nothing. When he saw what had happened and knew that all living men laid the blame at his feet, Then he was filled with a savage pride of a man who knows he is the master of life. So, like pure narcissism and sociopathy and psychopathy and fascism in 1984, the almost joy of having followers and disobedient people die. Followers die for you, and disobedient people die because of you. He came out of hiding and passed through the tents of the dying like a spirit himself. He went without fear into those camps where the stench of death filled his nostrils, and as he paused, he took all things he desired, even unto the belongings of the dead, which had been placed on the new graves by the survivors. He took 3 women, and these came with him without struggle, for their fear of the man stifled all thoughts of resistance. His wife, who had gone to Kakur, had been one of the first to die of the disease, and Kakumee was glad it was so, and to his new wives he sang songs of the power of the devil who was his torn rack. That year, just after the turn of the century, was the most evil year in all the time of the Helmut, nor will it be forgotten while men still live in the barrens. Yet it does not stand alone, for in the years which passed and followed, disaster after disaster came to the people who had survived the great pain. Along Tulimaliguac Ku, a little river which leads into the immense lake of the heaped up rib bones, were 5 igloos in the 3rd winter after the plague. But by spring, all 5 of those igloos were empty, for the deer had not come that way in the fall. It is told how a man came there in the days before spring to visit his brother. He found only naked, frozen bodies of the people he sought, and these were scattered far out from the igloos. This happened because a merciful madness which sometimes intervenes to bridge the last gap between starvation and death. Then the dying one tears off their clothing and with the last of their strength runs into the snows that their death may be quick and the long agony ended. This one episode was repeated year after year over the face of the plains, for the people were separated from one another, and one camp could not extend aid to another which was in peril, for often they did not know of the peril until it was too late to help. But despite famine and plague, the Helmut nevertheless slowly began to recover their numbers. They might have made good their losses in the time to come had not the fates seemed angered to see their resurgence. Although Kakumee never returned to the trading post, his visit was not forgotten. The traders remembered, and they thought of the untapped wealth of the barrens as miners think of a rich lode hidden deep in the mountains. So the traders pushed to the north. Slowly their posts crept up to the edge of the barrens, and here at last they renewed the lost contact with the Eskimos of the plains. It was in the second decade of this century that a band of the Hamut, driven south to the edge of the timber in search of the deer, came on the most northerly outpost of the traders. Now the contact was renewed and expanded, and trade with the people began. Many of the men procured guns and bought flour and lard, and for a while all those who went to the tiny outposts of the traders were secure from famine, though not from the hidden starvation and so also disease, which became increasingly virulent as their contacts with the white men increased. In the years which preceded the first great war of the white races, the value of white fox pelts shot rapidly upwards, and the trading concerns did their utmost to encourage the Ahamwood into an almost exclusive pursuit of fur. Then the war came, and with it there came a drop in the value of fox, and an abrupt discontinuation of the activity of the traders on the borderlands of the barrens. With the sudden withdrawal of the white traders and the cutting off of supplies of ammunition, the brief rally of the Hamlet came to an end. By 1926, only 300 of the Hamlet were left alive. One by one, the little camps had disappeared. Year by year, the number of new graves increased, while the number of children born in the starvation camps grew fewer. As the survivors failed, year after year, to meet the grim challenge, So failed their hearts, and so failed their will to survive. At last, loneliness drew the handful of living people together in the age old heart of the land under the little hills. The great loneliness grew more impressive until even Kakumee came back to the lakes of the Helmut and established his camp a few miles away from the remnants of the race he had helped to destroy. But in the post war boom years, in London, Montreal, and New York, the price of white fox fur rose again, and this time soared to a new record of value. The traders again remembered the people who dwelt in the plains, and they returned. From 1926 until 1930, no less than 7 fly by night trading posts operated for varying periods of time on the edges of the barrens. Once again, the traders handed out rifles and shells, flour and tea to the Helmut. Once again, the little band of survivors did as the traders desired. This time, the blow fell quickly. The traders withdrew once again, and by 1938, barely 100 survivors were left in the camps of the people. And in 1947, only 46 still remained. This was the pattern of life and death from the day of Kakume's return to the land from the south. During all of this time, the Helmut received no more aid from us than we might extend to rats haunting a refuse pile. Not until the year 1947 was any real effort made to investigate or to alleviate the conditions which prevailed in the barrens. Not until 1947 was any step taken to forestall the inevitable end of death's labors in the camps of the people. Not until 1950 did we really attempt to rectify our remissness, and that attempt was short lived. Now, when less than 2 score of the people exist, and when there are all too few women left of an age to give new life to the Helmut, we say we are ready to redeem our sins of omission, though in fact, as I write this, we have still done little but talk of what we will do for the Helmut. Yeah, I can think of a lot of stories of waiting until it's too late. It's much more easy to imagine wishing you had done the work to save something, the noble work in the past, when it can no longer be done, than to actually do it in the present. It's like looking back and wondering why America did and Europe didn't do more to help the Jews in World War II. And then here we are on the verge of new bad things. And once again, it's hard to do things in the moment. Yeah, it takes work and political capital and risking the comfort of your voters. And again, reality versus imagination. I do not know why we have waited so long. It was not that we had no word of the existence of the Hamlet. Tyrrell, who was an employee of the Canadian government, had told us about them in 1894. Traders have permits, and permits are issued by the government, so the authorities must at least have known of the existence of the Hamlet as early as 1912. Certainly, many people, both white and native, who lived along the coast, had heard of the presence of the scourge which was sweeping men from the barrens. As early as 1921, a coastal missionary at Churchill reported rumors of the death of nearly 500 men, women, and children in the interior during the course of one winter. But this report sank into limbo and was ignored. No, those who were responsible for the welfare of the Inuit could hardly have been completely unaware of the facts, even though these were so long hidden from the general sight of the world. In the black years following the coming of the Great Pain, men had many things to contend with in the barrens, and not least of these was Kakumee the shaman. During the times of famine, Kakumee always had food, rifles, and shells. If he did happen that he ran short of meat, then he drove his dog team to the camp of some fortunate man who had made a lucky hunt and took what he wanted. No one could resist. How does a man resist another who is not of this world, but of the world of devils and spirits? Makes me think of the movie The Usual Suspects, and um, I'm blanking on the name of the villain, but Kaiser Soze. Yeah, In the line, Kevin Spacey's character eventually says, who eventually proves to be Soze himself, apparently, says, "How do you shoot the devil in the back, Agent Coulihan? What if you miss?" How does a man resist another who is not of this world, but of the world of devils and spirits? Although Kakumee had several wives and he fed them all well, they gave him no children of his own, and so he knew the savage despair who one believes he is impotent. Bitterness lived in his loins, and this bitterness added new strength to his devil, so that he even stole children and called them his own. A few times starving men came to the place of Kakumee, and humbling their pride and bridling their fears, asked him for meat. But this son of Ajut knew nothing of giving. He turned the starving ones away, and they made their ways back to their camps or died on the trail. After a time, no one came near his camp, and Kakumee was alone with the women and children he had stolen, hated and feared by all those who lived. I find myself thinking of A Christmas Carol and um, Ebenezer Scrooge treasuring his money and hated by everybody. And I wonder if three ghosts of the barons from their mythology, their stories, would have been able to rescue his soul. Kakumee not only stole for pleasure or need, but from malice as well. I have heard a tale of a time when a man whom we shall call Anga set out in winter to go to the coast, hoping to obtain a rifle and shells. He was a brave Ihalmeo and a stubborn one, and he would not bow to the dictates of fate, so he made the long trip, taking nearly 2 months to complete it. He brought back a rifle and 2 cases of shells, and for a season his family and all the families under the little hills had meat in plenty. Then, one day in the winter, Kakumee drove his dogs to the house of Anga and entered the igloo. He spoke no words to those who were huddled within, but picked up the precious rifle and disappeared into the darkening shadows. How easy it is for narcissism and power to hate and despise people who seem weak and sick. They can start to seem like they deserve to be punished. The next day, Anga, despite the pleas of his wife and the advice of his neighbors, set out for the shores of Kakumee Kamanik. He swore that when he returned, he would bring his rifle safe on his sled. The day was dark, for snow fog was lying low over the hills. Anga and his dogs vanished quickly from the sight of those who stood outside their igloos to bid him good luck. The wife of Anga wept and let her hair down from the tugli as women do when they mourn for the dead. When spring came, Anga was found. His body lay in a crevice of a rock near the south end of Kakumee Kamanik, and it was said he had been killed by the she-devil, Paija, but there was a bullet through the bones of his chest. In the later days of my last year in the country, Kakumee became my frequent companion, for he believed that the prestige of showing himself to be at least my equal would strengthen his hold on the Helmuet. But perhaps more important to him was the irresistible fascination our belongings had for the devil who dwelt in his heart. One day, Ohoto warned Auntie and me that we too courted death from the hands of the devil Paija because of the riches we owned. But that was not true, for though Kakumee might have welcomed our deaths, he would hardly have had the courage to kill us. I did not repulse him, partly because I never quite mastered the cold chill I felt in his presence, but mainly because he was a rich source of stories about the Helmuet. However, in the last weeks of our stay in the land, we visited his camp, and what we saw there changed my relationship with old Kakumee. His 2 tents, one for himself and a young wife, and one for his old wife and 2 adopted or stolen children, were enormous, but filthy and in a poor state of repair. We were invited into the main tent, and its contents were as unbelievable as if we had found a pawn shop dropped down in the heart of the barrens. Hoarder, hoarder. The place was packed with rusted and useless items of white men's goods. There were parts of at least a dozen rifles and shotguns, all heavy with rust except for one or two kept in use. There were countless tin cans, an old cast iron stove with no bottom or top, tin pails which could no longer hold water, boxes of scrap, bits of metal and clothing, an ancient Edison gramophone with one cylindrical record, rusted and broken tools, and an endless profusion of other things, most of them ruined by time and neglect. There was also a great collection of tools, weapons, and even toys made by the people. I was appalled, for it was not simply the material wealth of one man I saw, but the wealth of a race, piled there to decay and to pass into dust, that one man's passion might be well fed. Useless junk, most of it, that in its time might well have helped the Helma to delay their progress to extinction. The tents of Kakumee were filled with the sterile wealth of his race, while the tents of that race were silent and empty of men. A few weeks later, Kakumee came to see me at Windy Cabin, for he knew we would soon depart, and he wanted to take possession of anything we might be persuaded into leaving behind. I was not glad to see him, for at last I was sickened by the incredible greed which had made him prey on his people even in death. I ordered him away and told him bluntly not to come back. I spoke in the presence of other men of the people, and the blow to Kakume's prestige must have been severe. However, he went only as far as his travel tent, pitched a few hundred yards away, and there he remained while our preparations to leave were completed. Now, in the Kindle book here is the drawing that I inserted to the main chapter picture. I don't know, I can't tell if it's again Kakumee. It doesn't look as repulsive as I expected and as the lead picture of chapter 13. But on the last day of my stay, I began to see Kakumee with clear perspective. At last I began to understand something of the tragedy which underlay and partly explained the apparent malice of the man. Now that my anger was gone, I was aware of the unexpected presence of pity. This curtain of evil which hung around Kakumee like a cloak became threadbare, for I had begun to see the depth of the calamity which had long ago come upon him. So I went to his camp, and from his parting words I learned what I should have guessed long before. Kakumee was squatting on his sleeping robes in the gloom of the tent. When at last he spoke, his head was turned from me, and his eyes fixed on a slit of white light showing along one of the seams of the tent. He spoke strongly and savagely of the days when his people had been happy and many. Then he faced me. "Now where are my people, you white man? When you went down to the banks of the river of men, did you not see my people? Did you not see the graves of the dead on every side of the land until the graves were as many as the hills that rise from the plains? And did you not listen and hear the voices of the people as they spoke of how it was that they had died? Those ghosts speak much of the Kablunai, the white men, who have all things in this world, but being greedy for more, took also the dear who were our life, and give us back only the great pain which sits in our chests until we die. You are rich, you are very rich, white man, richer in tea and in rifles and in shells than we of the people, and yet we too are rich, richer in graves and in ghosts, and this is your doing." Ah, the power of grievance and victimhood. So many applications these days. All of a tapestry. These were the last words I heard from the lips of the son of Ajut, and only then did I understand the full powers of the devil of Kakumee and know the immensity of the deception it had practiced upon him. I left his tent knowing what the old man himself will never know, such is the cunning of the devil who drove him, that the evils which were the gifts of the white men had been brought to the land and to the people in the body and in the mind of a man of the Ihamuit.